everyone. Welcome back. I'm Sonika Garcia.
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast that takes the BS out of behavioral science for marketers and non-marketers alike. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and to help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires. Thanks for listening in. Today's topic is taboos. And just to jump right in and start with the definition of a taboo is a social or religious custom prohibiting or forbidding the discussion of a particular practice or forbidding the association with a particular person, place, or thing.
So I just want to say that that's a pretty clean definition. Like when you look up what is a taboo, you get all sorts of strange things, and sometimes they're accurate, not whatever. But a taboo is a really big concept. Every society has things you can't talk about. So when you read this, it's like a social or religious custom prohibiting or forbidding blah, 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 right? Like that covers so much. Yep. And that's what makes it so interesting. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think applying it, so in health, we as consumers, patients, doctors, we're all really forced to face topics that are considered health taboos. So certain topics within women's health, sexual health, death and dying, mental health, just to name a few, these are all taboo topic. The way that the taboo kind of surfaces is different depending on place, region, and even within the US, certain, East Coast, West Coast, that sort of a thing. But as health communication professionals, it's really critical that we not only, understand, yes, what a taboo is, but also its roots, its cognitive drivers and the role within a complete health ecosystem that the taboo plays, especially if we aim to break them, right? In communication, we have to understand, okay, that these taboos exist. And if we're trying to address them in communication, we have to understand all of the components of this taboo. But I said, we need to understand in order to break them. But that's sort of my first question. And I would like to dive in. Brad, let me ask you, is it even possible to overcome a taboo with advertising or break a taboo? Like, is that even possible?
So those are two different questions, right? It is not, in my opinion, possible to break a taboo. Those two words don't go together. You don't break taboos except for to violate them, right?
Okay, yep.
But we can definitely overcome them. And I think something that we're going to talk about as this episode goes on is the relationship between taboos, stigma, and shame. And I want to introduce an idea like right off the bat that they're not the same thing and they sort of exist in a cascading relationship. So taboo is a societal wide belief around things you should or shouldn't talk about. We don't find certain things appropriate. I'm going to go back to the list of topics you went through in a second, right? But those are taboos. Those are beliefs and those are customs and habits. Individuals who violate taboos become stigmatized. They become associated with that taboo. So if you're not supposed to do something and you do it, then you are marked out, right? The Scarlet Letter, the old novel. That's a stigma. Literally, they put it's a mark, right? And then shame is what the individual feels or not. And you can reject that shame. You can, Easy A was the riff off of the Scarlet Letter, right? And she rejected the shame. She was like, no, I'm going to proudly wear this. I don't care what you think. And that's a really interesting sort of distinction, I think, for a lot of people that, like, what are we talking about when we talk about in healthcare breaking a taboo? It's been taboo to talk about women's periods directly in a lot of societies, this one included. But do we stigmatize women for having periods? Can we destigmatize that? Do they feel shame? So you kind of go down this cascade. And I think it's not really possible, nor is it feasible. I'll just start at the end, right? I don't think it's feasible or even advisable for us to try and break taboos with advertising. All you do is upset people. But what we can do is destigmatize things, and we can remove shame from the individual, right? So you mentioned the list of taboo subjects: women's health, sexual health, death and dying, mental health. I've worked in all of those, right? So have you probably, right? But my postdoc was in end-of-life care. I literally studied doctors who were telling patients they were dying. I worked in women's health many times. NuvaRing is a vaginally inserted ring. And one of the challenges with it is you had to tell people, I have a patch, I have a pill, and I have this ring you put in your vagina. And people go, no, thanks. And I'm not going to use that word anymore because even the word sort of starts to upset people, right? So I think taboos are tricky. I think there's always people who are allowed to break those taboos in certain situations, priests, doctors, but you still can't do it at the dinner table, you know? So
Right.
it's time, it's place, it's people. And because of the nature of our work as advertisers, we put things on subway panels and interrupt the evening news. And so we have to be really thoughtful about where and when and how we address these topics. That's what taboo really means. It doesn't mean that it's never to be uttered. Sometimes it does, but a lot of times it means you just can't talk about it directly, right? I mean, even now, like one's reaction to pronouncements on transgender athletes
Mhm.
can be very contentious. I think the topic is taboo. I don't know if the individuals discussing it feel stigma or shame. They feel self-righteous. And that's the other
Mm.
thing that happens is when you break a taboo, you've got to be really careful because you will offend and upset people who think that you have addressed something that the natural order is built around. That the reason that we are human and not animals is because we don't poop in the supermarket or have sex on the train or something like that. That there's things we do in private, animals do it in public, and you have upset the natural order of things. And then, you know, like you ask, can you break taboos? I think artists do it all the time. I somebody just sent me a piece called "Terribly Wrong" by Tracy Emin, and it's pretty jarring. It's a line drawing, and it was around the time when she was having a lot of personal crises, and she had terminated a pregnancy, and it's pretty graphic. I'm not going to describe it, but you know, it's a way of her working through, I guess, I mean, according to her, like what she was going through at the time, but to the viewer, it really challenges you because it sort of shows things that we typically associate with stuff you would never talk about in public, let alone make a painting and hang on a
Mhm.
wall. And I think that comes up a lot that like taboos aren't just things that exist. People are constantly violating them
Yeah.
for artistic purposes, for personal purposes. Murder is taboo, incest is taboo, all of those things. Just because they're taboo doesn't mean we don't do them.
Mhm.
I think how you personally feel about them when you're involved in them is the part that we can handle, right? And some of what we're going to talk about, like trigger warning stuff, you know, like the survivors of priestly abuse, many of them felt unspeakable shame over what had happened, and that prevented them from speaking out. And when they did speak out, they were stigmatized by their communities and it was denied. And it really profoundly shook people's sort of views of the world and what we've been able to do in modern times. From, I mean, again, I have no personal experience with any of this, but you know, reading a lot of the accounts, that destigmatizing and removing the shame from the victims has been fundamental for them to move forward in their lives, for them to be able to tell their stories and not have to just carry this burden of shame. So that I do think we can do. But do I think that we could just start talking about, you know, irritable bowel in a direct way and go tired of pooping this way? I think people would be upset by that if we did that on TV. I don't think it would be helpful, and I don't think it would overcome the taboo. I think people would think we were insane.
That's really interesting, and I think to that point, thinking about taboos and where they exist and going into there are two types of taboos. So there are universal taboos that exist everywhere. It really doesn't matter where you live, what part of the world. Things like incest, for example. And then there are things like there are cultural taboos. So that's really dependent on region and culture. In certain cultures in the US, it's taboo to ask how much money someone makes, but in other cultures, that's really not taboo, and there's that level of transparency that's comfortable for people. So I guess my question to you is, are both of them difficult to break or overcome? Can cultural taboos evolve over time and become less taboo? Like, how can that evolve and potentially change?
Yeah, so there are universal taboos. You mentioned incest.
Hmm.
It makes sense, right? Incest creates, if you engage in incestuous procreation over time, you end up with deformed children. And you know, human beings went through many periods throughout the world where in prehistory, there was just too small a number of humans to safely procreate. And so you kind of learn very quickly as a tribe that you really need to like mate with people upriver or downriver, or bad things are going to happen. And so those kind of taboos, I think, are really bred in the bone, as Shakespeare would say, right? I think we avoid certain things like poop because they're biohazards. I think death is terrifying. I think animals are scared of death just like we are, but they don't think about it and ruminate on it the way we do. So I think those are the big three, right? Pooping, procreating, and pushing up daisies, the three P's, right? Sex, death, and poop. I think what's interesting is you look at something like menstrual blood, which is a biohazard, but it's also the result of menstruation, which is something that happens to women of childbearing age on a monthly basis, provided they're well fed and all the rest of it, right? And so do we avoid the liquid, the substance that, is excreted by the body? Yeah, but then do we attribute stigma and shame to the women? That's something we're talking about right now. That's something we're
Mhm.
dealing with right now. And you and I have had a lot of discussions about this one where, there's a fine line between feeling like we've destigmatized periods and we're glorifying period blood, and it's a
Mhm.
hard line to really know where it is. I mean, I think, again, I'm a big fan of rugby. The women's national team in Scotland just got their shorts changed. Away uniforms are white, home uniforms are team colors. So the away shorts for women's rugby were white. And finally, the women were like, can we not have to worry about showing a period stain on the field on national television? And all the women's professional rugby teams have changed their shorts to dark blue or black, even for away games.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's a step backwards or a step forwards, right? On the one hand, are we supposed to be destigmatizing periods? On the other hand, aren't athletes supposed to feel comfortable in their own bodies? And there's a whole sort of thing about women's athletic gear becoming more athletic and less titillating, let's say, right? Like the whole shrink it and pink it and making women play beach volleyball and essentially string thong bikinis, like that's gone away or going away, and that's a good thing. But are we re-stigmatizing periods by telling people that we don't want to show period blood while they're playing rugby? I don't think so. I think it's like their own choice, but it's kind of a foreign thing to me. And you tell me, what do you think? Is that a step forward, backwards, or just a lateral move?
Definitely interesting. I mean, I think, like, based on this conversation, there are certain things that we have to accept as taboo and talk around them. Or, you mentioned on commercials for tampons and pads, they still use blue liquid. I don't know if necessarily using red liquid is going to make people uncomfortable or if that's actually what's going to result in destigmatizing. I don't necessarily think that if we are trying to destigmatize and help the shame component of it, we need to be having people shout like period blood, like, free the period down the street. I know that that's a movement. And if that's what you're comfortable with, I think that environment should be created for you. But I don't necessarily think that that's the way to overcome stigma. I think a lot of times people think that just talking about it very bluntly and openly, like that's the only way. But people don't, not all people necessarily feel comfortable with that. And I can speak for myself as a woman. I don't think that's necessarily what it's going to take for me to feel like I'm comfortable wearing white when I'm on my period. I just don't necessarily think that that's the solution either. I think what's more important is that we need young girls and women to feel okay about their menstrual cycle and to know that periods itself are not shameful. And I think we've gotten to that place without necessarily being okay to show blood, but knowing it's okay to say, hey, I'm on my period. I can't do this right now. Or, being able to discuss it. I think that's a big step forward. And even just in my adult lifetime, I've seen that change. And I think, really as healthcare communication extraordinaires, as I say, and marketers, it's two things. It's how can we foster dialogue that makes people feel more comfortable to discuss it. So whether that be between the doctor and the patient, whether that be just consumers in general out there in the world. So what does it mean to actually make people from different cultural backgrounds and also being
Right,
mindful of that, right? I think
right.
that's a big part of it.
It's a biggie.
growing up in an Indian American household is very different than some of my American friends, and how they spoke about periods. So I think that's a part of it. I think the other thing is to create an environment that so it's the dialogue, and then it's also the physical environment. And I think it's you know especially, and maybe this isn't related to periods, but going back to like sexual health and women's health, in doctors' offices and in OB clinics and stuff. I just think that creating an environment that feels a little bit more welcoming to have certain conversations could be a good step forward. It still feels very clinical and sterile and
It's
cold.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
it just doesn't feel like a place where you want to talk about certain things.
So
So I don't know.
that's yeah, that's really interesting. I've got a couple examples I want to go through, like because of what you just sort of brought up. It's really interesting. Like what, I said right at the very beginning, like our job is to destigmatize things and to allow
Mhm,
people to move past shame or not feel shame or address their own. I mean, I think shame is not a terrible thing. It's okay to be ashamed if you did something terrible. I think actually the society has sort of lost all sense of shame, but now I just sound like a really old guy, so whatever, right? But I don't think it's positive when you need to talk about things. So you just brought up like, is the clinical environment too clinical? And
mhm,
the answer is I don't have an answer, but I will tell you the reason sometimes that we make things clinical is because it removes them from the everyday, and we think of ourselves as very logical creatures. And taboo is actually a Polynesian word, tapu, and it's
mm,
I think that's the Hawaiian, right? I think it's tafu somewhere else. And I'm not a Polynesian linguist, but I remember learning it. And it's this sort of societal thing where like there's spaces that you can't go to as well, and we don't think of taboos as being related to place and space, but they are. So I always talk about this. One of the things about suspending taboos, every society has taboos. Every society has people who are allowed to break those taboos and discuss them with you and to look at your private places and to ask you about your poop or your sexual health or everything. But they can't just do it wherever, whenever. So if you want to confess to a priest, you go into a confessional. If you want to talk to your doctor, you go through three doors typically. You go between the door from the outside world to the waiting room, and then you go from the waiting room into the hallway. And sometimes you actually do minor medical things there, like get weighed. And then you go into the doctor's exam room or the healthcare provider. They're not always doctors these days. And that is when the taboos sort of fall away and you take off your
mhm,
clothes and they go like, let's take a look and all that sort of stuff. So that part, I think, making it clinical actually helps in fostering a discussion because you've sort of marked out to people you're in this safe space. You're in a space where taboos are suspended, where the doctor can ask you, are you having an affair? Do you think you have a sexually transmitted disease? Do all this sort of stuff. And, I bring that last one up because I was a hospital interpreter for a bit. And my dissertation was on hospital interpreting. And one of the interesting things is it really, really, really violates the sanctity of the doctor patient sort of exam room space when you bring a child in to interpret for adults. And a
mhm,
lot of times immigrants are forced to do that. If you speak Tongan or if you speak, Fijian or Vietnamese and they don't have an interpreter on staff, a lot of times people will bring their kid and they're being asked to translate things that are, or interpret, technically, it's the verbal version, right? They're being asked to interpret things that are just just inappropriate for a child and also violate things like family norms. That's one of the apocryphal stories you get told when you train as a hospital interpreter is the kid might not be able with the kid present or with the adult sibling or whatever family member present, they might not be able to have a comfortable discussion about what's really bothering them because they might be violating some kind of societal taboo on their end. You asked about taboos in terms of like, do they change? I think it was taboo for certain races to be seen in public together, and that's gone away, right? But I don't think we are comfortable with the idea that children should be forced to address things that are above their age grade, as it were. So it all gets very, very interesting. And getting back to this idea of like, is it better if we make it more comfortable? I have no idea. I've never been to an OB. I've never been present at a pelvic exam, which is, in my mind, the most intrusive thing that women go through. but I do know what they sound like because I worked for a company that we would record doctor-patient interactions, audio record them and listen to the transcripts and stuff. And what's interesting is there's a certain word that almost never gets used, even between an OB and her patient, which is the word vagina. And so if you look at transcripts of doctor-patient dialogues in cardiology, you will have the doctor say, "Let me listen to your heart." If you look at transcripts of an ENT visit, they'll go, "Let me look down your throat, let me look in your ears, let me look up your nose." If you look at transcripts from OBGYN visits, they go, "Let's take a look."
Mhm.
And they don't say the word. The other one that's really funny is the expression scooch down is everywhere. So I've never been in one of these, but I know scooch down, let's take a look is a very common experience and or a phrase. And every time I bring this up, most of the women in the group that I'm talking to just burst out laughing, or at least like,
Mhm.
it resonates. Scooch down, let's
Yeah.
take a look. You
Yep.
don't have to say it if everybody knows what you're talking about. And so we had a client who wanted to break the taboo of the V word. I'm going to stop using it. I'm not trying to get in trouble here, right? And the reality is they decided that using it a lot would help destigmatize the word. That did not work. All it did was make them seem insane. They had a lot of fake testimonials of women going, "Well, once I put it in my vagina, it felt great." And you'd go, no one would actually say that. They would say, "Once I put it in, it felt great." And everybody would know where they were talking about, and everybody would understand it. And so there's this balance of, do we need to be explicit about what we're talking about, or can we sort of roll along with the societal norm? And if everybody knows what we're talking about, it's fine. I think that's the mistake we sometimes make, that in order to make something non-taboo, we have to discuss it openly. If it makes people uncomfortable, we don't. What we have to do is give people an opportunity to talk about it in a way, in a place, in a time, in a manner that they are comfortable with. And that's, I think,
Mhm.
getting to your idea. It's the longest answer I've ever given to anything, and I give some long answers. Back to your idea of like, should we make it more comfortable? So I don't know. I mean, what do you think? Would it make it easier for you or your daughter, do you think, if it was like a prettier space, or does the clinical space sort of remove the shame and stigma from the everyday sort of interaction?
I don't know. That's I was thinking about I think certain topics or certain yeah, like certain discussions as you mentioned, a few for me I'm stuck on like I think with women's health and saying the word vagina and feeling comfortable to express like the women's body the way that it like using the proper anatomical terms. I think in order to it's like what came first? Do we make the outside world less stigmatized and then hope that that translates to the clinical world? Or do we have to start in the clinical world and hope that that translates to the outside world? And it feels like the latter is probably a better approach. And I think that creating more of an environment that's similar to the outside world. So, like making more inviting healthcare spaces. Yes, at first it might feel odd, like, I don't feel like I'm in a doctor's office, so I feel like it might be weird to talk about, but maybe that's what's really needed to then kind of break down that barrier, because otherwise you say certain things in the doctor's office because if you feel like you're in a different space, and then you go out into the world and you're just like, "Oh, well, I cannot say the same thing because it just feels so different." And I think that with certain taboo topics, women's health being one of them, and maybe because I'm speaking on my own, like, desires, yeah, I do wish that it can become a little bit more similar and seamless between the two, because I think that's really how that taboo topic will evolve.
So I'll
Yeah,
give
I
you, yeah,
yeah.
I'll give you two more examples then, right? When not related to women's health, of areas where we've managed to destigmatize things to the benefit of the patients. So one would be mental health. So for a long time, depression was seen as sort of shameful, and in many places it still is. I think a lot of people still have misconceptions about mental health in general. I think it scares us, frankly. I think part of what makes things taboo is they scare us. Death scares us. Sex doesn't scare us, right? Sex is the fun one, but it can be scary too, certainly. And then poop and snot and pee and blood and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes it just repels people, But mental health really does scare us in some ways. And one of the things we were able to do, I still think mental health is taboo and scary in some ways, but we managed to medicalize it. We managed to say to people, it's not a moral failing. It's not a failure on your part of, mental fortitude. You're not weak. You have a chemical imbalance. And that, whether you agree or disagree, rightly or wrongly, whatever, that approach, when the first SSRIs came out, really validated um, the patients that they weren't just weak and that it shouldn't be shameful and that they could, in fact, do something about this that wasn't their fault. And it's something that we often talk about in our industry is, can we make something not the patient's fault? It's not your fault that you got cancer. It's not your fault that you're depressed. It's not your fault that you have impotence. And so we often will change the language so that the patient themselves has an easier time accepting the diagnosis. We deliberately, for addiction, stopped talking about addiction and started talking about dependence, because it's much easier for people to look in the mirror and say, I'm a little bit dependent, not, I think I'm an addict. There's a lot of baggage with that. I think it's easier for people to say, I have erectile dysfunction. And even the verbs you use, you have erectile dysfunction, as opposed to I am impotent, which means powerless,
Hmm.
So I think we've done a good job of removing stigma by removing blame and shame. But I still think mental health is slightly taboo. And again, go back to that original definition. It's prohibited, or it's something that you shouldn't talk about directly. So I think people are scared of mental health. I think people misunderstand mental health. I don't know if, as a society, there's this thing, NAMI, North American. Oh shoot, I should have really looked that one up. But it's on the mental illness. It's a
Yep.
group, and they come out with stigma busters all the time. I think they're right. I think we have to try and break the stigma around some of these things. But I also think it's really about the individual being comfortable being able to treat themselves so that they don't feel shame and that they can talk to their doctor. And it's nobody else's business if they're on antidepressants. If they want to talk about it, they can. But I'm not in the business of changing society around mental health. I'm in the business of trying to make it so that patients who suffer from depression can get the help they need and should have access to. So that, I
Hmm.
think that's a pretty big one.
Yeah.
Um, I think another one that would resonate with people would be HIV, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a
We
huge one.
we sex is taboo in general, but it's titillating. Sex sells, and we often in advertising, not in our world, but we use sex to sell everything, and people will go right up to the line. Vegas, Taboo is the name of a nightclub, and what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Vegas sells itself as a space where taboos are suspended and where you won't be held accountable for what you did there. That's exactly what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas means, right? What happens in Cleveland, everyone's going to know about. But if you leave Cleveland and go to Vegas, you can get away with whatever sinning you want, and then you can go back home. That's the sort of promise. I think when those of us, especially who are old enough to remember the whole arc of the HIV crisis, at the beginning of that, there was very overt discussion that some people deserved care more than others, and that there were victims who were blameless. Ryan White was the poster child for that. He was a kid. I think he was hemophilia. He had hemophilia, but he got HIV through a transfusion. And it was much more palatable for many people in this country to think of helping him as we looked for cures or treatments for HIV than helping people who were engaging in behavior that, frankly, they felt should be punished. And so that's something where we've really moved past that. We're much better now in 2023. I don't know how many people still feel the way they did in the 80s, but we don't have elected officials standing on a podium going, they don't deserve this because they earned their punishment from God. We have ads on TV going, look, you can take this drug, and if you're in a certain demographic engaging in certain behaviors, it'll prevent you from getting HIV. That's a good thing, right? So again, I think it kind of goes from the bottom up, not the top down. I think it's the individuals who destigmatize who refuse to feel shame, who then sort of eventually change the taboo, and going back to like interracial couples and stuff. It's the brave people or the people in love or just the people who engaged in those behaviors publicly, who really put up with a lot of societal guff, for lack of a better term, and that is way underselling what they put up with. They're the ones who ended up creating an environment in which the kinds of marriages that we see all the time now, they're not considered taboo. And if they are considered taboo, the people who consider them taboo, it's now taboo to voice that opinion in public. So yeah, things do switch around, but I do think it starts with the individual. And I think our job as marketing extraordinaires, as you call us, is to help destigmatize the individual who engaged in the behavior. Nobody deserves any of these things. Deserve is a really loaded word. And nobody should feel shame about any of these things. Whether or not we can make society accept it is the next step. But certainly an individual should be allowed to find care and feel good about themselves. I mean, that's my sort of like 2 cents, but that's something I stand on pretty strongly. And our industry gets criticized quite a bit. Like, why do you advertise drugs and stuff? This is why. I'm telling you, this is why. Because our job allows us to address some of these very unfair things that prevent people from getting care because they're behaving in a way that people don't approve of around them. Well, it's none of your business, man. It's between the doctor and the patient. And there's a reason the Hippocratic Oath says, like, well, or I'll go to the Oath of Maimonides, which I really like. Let me not forget that my patient is a fellow human being in pain, right? That's empathy. And I think
Mhm.
really the antidote to stigma and shame is empathy. So anyway, that was again a very long answer, but I think there are a number of cases that we can look at that go, the pharmaceutical industry, for all of its flaws, every industry has flaws, right? For all of its flaws, it's done tremendous work destigmatizing conditions and removing shame from individuals.
I love that. Thank you for that background and that information. I think there's a lot to unpack, but I think what's the most interesting is this concept of the difference of taboos and stigma being a result of taboos, and really understanding that in our roles, it's to destigmatize and to create communications, environments, basically help foster behavior change that is more, accepting and essentially destigmatizes. But I think in a lot of conditions, we've made great strides, but in a lot, we still have a long way to go. So I think that we should, keep the discussion open. I think a big takeaway is understanding, the difference between, the stigmas that exist in different cultures. We are global and we do this work globally. So I think our approach for, women's health in the US is obviously going to be very different than our approach for women's health in the EU or in Asia. So I think, just really understanding it. We're culture seekers and understanders, and that, that's what we, I think I made up a word. And that's what we try to do in our work. So I think that really ties nicely into taboos and stigmas as well, and making sure that we're understanding that the person, their lived experience, the culture that they come from, and even in the US, right? Like, we are a land of immigrants. And I just gave an example for myself, being a first generation
Right.
Indian American. I'm not going to receive communications on women's health the same way as someone who's had generations and generations of family in the US. So, yeah, I just think that all of those nuances need to be taken into consideration to really do a good job to help break stigma. So,
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, look, I know we're trying to wrap up, but I think, we've talked about all the sort of physical, biological stuff. I think one of the things that people also misunderstand is that the idea that there are words that are prohibited to say is not a modern idea. It is not an easy thing to overcome. Sometimes words become so powerful you can't even say them. That's sort of a magical moment for words. I'm magical, I'm doing big air quotes, not like, oh, I'm so happy. I more mean like magical is in they've suddenly moved into the realm of like they have magical abilities to do more than just be a word, right? There are some words that are so powerful you cannot say them. You have to refer to them. Now, it used to be things like God. You couldn't use the Lord's name in vain. You couldn't write God on a piece of paper. If you did, you had to dispose of it a certain way and stuff like that. Now it's things like N word, C bomb, right? Like those are words that are so powerful and that we have adjudged as a society that they should just simply not be uttered in public, that we actually have codes for them now. F-bomb, and so it is interesting to me that much of what we work on is unnameable in some ways, but has to be named in others. And I think this is where you end up with these very clinical, cold sounding terms. They're very off putting, but they also remove the emotion from it. So end of life decision making as opposed to death choices, right? I think there's something to be said for end of life as opposed to death as a way of not causing psychic harm to people. I think we have to remember that if a term is taboo, it may be because people just don't like hearing it, and it's not our job to slap them in the face with it over and over and over again. That's the only other point I wanted to be making is let's not try and push the envelope on saying and putting things in people's faces that they don't necessarily need.
Great. Okay, so I love the discussion. I hope that our listeners find it helpful and useful. I know everyone kind of hears the word taboo, but to break it down, hopefully was something new for everyone. And if there's any part of this discussion that you think, you want us to dig a little bit deeper into, please reach out as always, medicalanthropology@havas.com. And yeah, Brad, anything else?
National Alliance for Mental Illness. That's
Yeah.
NAMI.
Yep.
Thank you for that. All right. Thanks, guys. I know this was
Thank
long,
you.
so thanks, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.
Breaking the Code is a podcast by Havas Health and Youth Medical Anthropology Department. Created and produced by Brad Davidson and Sanika Garcia. Content editing done by Catherine Rossi. Post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration by all of you. Thanks for listening and your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a rating and subscribe. Until next time.